Items 4 and 5 are recorded by Hansard. Agreed?
Agreed.
Apologies from Dominic. Any other apologies?
Archie.
Draft minutes, pages 5 to 8. Members content their record.
Agreed.
Can refer members to the summary table of requests, pages 10 to 13 for noting. Moving on to the first briefing of the day from SIPFA. If you refer to your papers, pages 15 through to 27 of your packs. And can I welcome Mr. Alan Birmingham to the committee? You're very welcome, Alan. Alan is the Policy and Technical Manager of the Chartered Institute of Public Finance and Accountancy. Alan, do you want to make a brief opening statement to the committee, and then we'll go to questions?
Yes, thanks, Chairperson, for the opportunity to attend. I suppose, just by way of introduction, as he said, it's Alan Birmingham. I'm the Policy and Technical Manager. I have a remit for looking after the devolved regions of the UK and Ireland. The Chartered Institute of Public Finance and Accountancy, as the name suggests, is a chartered accounting body. We're probably considering ourselves the specialists in public financial management. Most of our members would be working in public finance or related fields. We've worked reasonably closely with some of the other inquiries in the Barnett formula, and I suppose I'd maybe make main points in our submission to you. One thing I would say is that I feel, looking at the evidence that you've had to date, and given that your terms of reference is to come up with some kind of report to inform the Assembly and add to that debate, it strikes me a little bit that you've had a lot of academic input from the experts. I would hope that the Institute's submission could maybe put a bit more practicality on that. And we would probably challenge, I suppose, some of the evidence that you've had to date in terms of particularly around the issues of whether it's currently benefiting Northern Ireland or not, and maybe what position you should take as a result of that. So just talking about the main points of our submission, obviously we have mentioned in our submission that we see the way forward as withdrawing the Barnett formula, primarily because we see it as fairly unequitable. It doesn't lead to a great deal of accountability at a devolved level. It doesn't take account of need, and obviously increasing pressure from, I suppose, as a result of the Scottish referendum, increasing pressure on further devolved powers will probably make the Barnett formula even more irrelevant and kind of archaic in its operation. And I think you've had plenty of evidence that suggests that it's not fit for purpose, and we would fully support that view. We think that some of particularly the vow that was made to Scotland after the referendum by the UK Westminster governments about retaining the Barnett formula, yet at the same time devolving more powers, particularly tax powers, and being able to hang on to some of those financial levers is kind of at odds with each other and doesn't really work. I think it's fair to say as an observation that Scotland particularly probably does benefit from that and benefits from the Barnett formula and continuing with the operation of that. But I think it's unfair and it's unequitable to suggest that if you get further fiscal powers and you get further fiscal levers at your disposal, that the Barnett formula is suitable for that kind of environment to operate. And I suppose that's why we're saying it should be withdrawn, replaced with something that's more needs-based, provides more accountability, is more equitable, really. And those are the things that are missing from the current Barnett formula approach. I suppose, the other thing that we mentioned in our submission is that we feel that obviously a lot of the kind of controls around the Barnett formula are held by Treasury. Effectively, Treasury dictate things like bypass arrangements, and an outline in their statement of funding policy how the operation of the formula works. I suppose we believe that if we're going to move to a more kind of devolved, I'm not saying fully autonomous type devolved assemblies, but if we're moving down that route, we believe that the operation of the formula should be taken away from that kind of approach and put with an independent body. And I think that chimes quite well with the House of Lords Commission that looked at this back in 2009. So we would fully support that view as well. One point we did make in our submission, which I suppose when I say is maybe at odds or challenge some of the academic view that you've had before, is that we were saying that it would be perhaps in your interest to kind of widen up your remit and, from a Northern Ireland perspective, actually lead some of the debate on what should replace the Barnett formula. I think we say that in the view that Northern Ireland is maybe best placed for that, in the sense that if you look at any of the studies that have been done on needs-based assessment before, and I can point to 3 probably, it would suggest that Northern Ireland, out of the 3 devolved areas, is probably closer to its needs-based position than the other 2. You know, Wales perhaps being underfunded, Scotland being perhaps overfunded, and Northern Ireland being within a sort of reasonable statistical variation of perhaps where it should be. I mean, there's 2 Treasury studies. Obviously, they go way back and it's not up to date or anything like that. And there's probably 1,000,001 ways that you can produce statistics to cut this cake. But essentially, the 76, 177 type area and the one completed in the 90s, early 90s, suggested that Northern Ireland was perhaps closest to its needs-based assessment. And obviously, I think one of your previous evidence from Ian McLean suggests, although it's quite a crude calculation between sort of GVA, using GVA as a kind of relative assessment of where, you know, needs-based is, against that sort of suggested that you were just marginally below your needs-based assessment. So I suppose taking a view that there's 3 bits of evidence there, you know, if I was going to draw a conclusion from that, say that Northern Ireland is perhaps closest out of the 3 devolved regions to its needs-based funding level. However, having said that, you know, Barnett has its simplicity and ease of use and things like that, but it's not a needs-based calculation. I think if you want to get to a point where you perhaps retain tax incomes and things like that and have more hands on fiscal levers, undoubtedly the measure is going to come under a lot of pressure under those circumstances to be changed. I think it's fair to say that this has been tinkered around with for years and years, so it's not a new debate, but what it is I suppose a debate that's coming to a head potentially. So where Dr. Gudgeon suggested to you that you might be best keeping your head down and sort of saying nothing, because there's this perception that you benefit from it. I think we'd be saying that if you want to get to a fair and equitable position funding-wise, there's an opportunity to be at the forefront of that debate rather than put your head in the sand. And I would strongly suggest to you that if you're going to influence policy, keeping your head down and saying nothing is probably not the best way to go about it. You're going to leave it in the hands of Treasury and others then to make those decisions for you. And I certainly wouldn't advocate that. So,
thank you very much. Just on that last point, what do you mean that we need to be at the forefront of the debate? What points should we be making? Are you saying that in terms of the devolved areas having more transparency in terms of financial data to inform decision making? What area are you trying to direct us towards there?
Well, I think the difficulty will be not so much that there's a recognition that, you know, at some point there needs to be a subvention to the devolved regions. You know, if you're going to, let's say, retain more tax revenues yourself in the future, be it income tax, VAT, corporation tax, whatever it happens to be, and some of the smaller taxes, if you actually retain those, I suppose think about it, I always think about it in the local government analogy, you know, they raise taxes in terms of rates, they retain them. There's a regional rate goes into a pot and it gets redistributed. Now, in effect, that gets redistributed on a needs basis as well, because I've been involved in that there's some input done by councils into DOE, which goes into statistics and gets reallocated as a rate support grant to them based on a kind of deprivation type need, some kind of assessment. I'm not exactly sure how that works, but the principle is really what I'm on about. And obviously
that's the principle that was set out in Smith in terms of Scotland. That
yeah, exactly.
Anything you generate stays within.
So I think the difficulty is not so much about the principles and the fact that I know there's been a lot of academic work saying that getting to a needs-based assessment is risky, you know, it's difficult and all that. But I think there's plenty of examples of where needs-based assessments are available in public funding. You know, I've got a report here on the police grant for England and Wales, and that's done on a needs-based assessment as well. It's distributed that way, and that's a £4.5 billion grant. So there's lots of examples of where that's available. I think what the difficulty is agreeing what those needs-based measures are, not that you couldn't do it. And I suppose that's where, you know, the debate comes down to that negotiation. I think first of all you've got to decide, you know, is there change pending in this area? And I think the evidence suggests that it's going to come under more pressure. And all the main parties in Westminster are promising further powers, including changing things around England as well, you know, English votes for English laws, all sorts of things like that, devolution of certain funding to major cities and things like that. Aside from that, so I think it's evident it's going to come under more pressure. Will it change? Obviously, I haven't got a crystal ball. But what I'm saying is if it does come down to getting down to actually implementing those changes, I think having your voice at the table to say these are the measures that we think are important and things like that would be a quite important debate. So to me, that's the opposite of keeping your head down, saying nothing. It's actually trying to lead the debate that, yes, we have a need, and here's the sort of measures that we think are evident that should be included in that.
You did?
Thanks, Chair, and thanks, Alan, for your presentation to start off with. Regarding the Barnett Squeeze, or the convergence between the public spending per head of population here and the UK,
Yeah.
you know, I'm mindful of the difficulties which you highlighted in paragraphs 3.4 and 3.6. Your paper around inadequate data. How might we establish whether convergence has actually occurred in Northern Ireland context?
Yeah, I mean, I'm aware that everybody says it's difficult to measure, and I accept that. I think convergence is probably a very slow process. So I think you need to take a longer view, and certainly if you just look anecdotally at the statistics that are available, in the 70s, for example, you were in Northern Ireland probably spending about, let's say, England's 100%, you were about 131, 135. And more recently, you're down to about 121, 122. That about 20% above that kind of English spending level or funding level. So I suppose just anecdotally on that, you could deduce that the way the formula works and the way that has gone down, and that's consistent across the other regions, there is evidence of convergence.
Could we draw any parallels between the Holden findings in Wales and compared to what we're happening here?
I'm not sure really, you know. Yeah, I'm not too sure on that. Yeah, I mean, certainly it's a difficult one to measure, and I think there's an inherent mathematical point in the formula, which means that because you're getting funded on a per capita basis, the same as England, the way the consequentials work, obviously, it means that in the long run, and it is the long run, there will be convergence in that. I don't think that was the original intention, really, of the formula either, but that's the way it works. And I suppose consequently, coincidentally at the moment as well, where there's a squeeze on funding, that convergence has either slowed or sort of levelled out, really. And that's a consequence of the way the formula works as well. So.
Well, what are the risks for us here being underfunded in terms of relevant need in the future due to long-term convergence? Well,
I suppose SITFA takes the view that, you know, we're an independent body, so we kind of take the view that, you know, it's what sort of government or powers you want to have. So the accountability issue, in my mind, plays a big part in that. You know, if you've got, on the one hand, more hand on fiscal levers like tax raising powers and various other levers like that, the ability to hold reserves, much more year-end flexibility, and so on and so forth, you've probably, you've got more of an accountable link between the taxes you're raising and what you're spending. The subvention, that kind of makes up the gap, because obviously it's fair to say that most of the regions, if not all of the regions in the UK, probably don't generate enough tax outside of the South East to actually pay for all their services. So that redistribution happens on a needs basis. But I suppose it's the point about, at the moment, there's maybe a frustration that things you maybe want to do to rebalance the economy here and things like that, you actually don't really have enough fiscal levers to do that. You're really a kind of devolved spending body without many levers to do that. So I think, yeah, there is a point that maybe there will be a long transition if it did change, you know, maybe several years before you got to the point where you were fully out on your own. But you have the opportunity with that to actually, you know, develop the economy as you see fit. And that's the prize, I suppose.
Sure. Well, how feasible may it be then to introduce a supplementary or a top-up mechanism to take account of the relevant need we have here?
Yeah, I think there's been evidence before about, the name escapes me now, of the commission that did that, whether it was Holton or somebody else, but looked at a mechanism to actually supplement the Barnett formula. So apart from the comparability bit and then the population-based bit, putting in a kind of ceiling or base level to reflect need in the devolved regions, and that would kind of eliminate the convergence element. So that's eminently doable. Yeah. But I suppose you're still maintaining the fundamental flaw in the formula that it's not reflecting needs. And I mean, for example, obviously the kind of baseline originally was giving you an element of funding above England when it first started. And the baseline, say, population-wise and things like that, apart from, you know, more recently where those statistics have been available and the consequentials are updated year by year based on population. But the original baseline never probably has been. And it's probably fair to say as well that Northern Ireland's population growth has perhaps been greater than Scotland and Wales. So in some respects that's a detriment really. And, you know, you've maybe lost out through that.
So you think there's room there for some sort of top-up?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
Thanks, Jeff.
Okay. John?
Thanks, Chair. I suppose a couple of points. I mean, you were talking about the crystal ball, and it was more around the point, do you think, I mean, how likely do you think Barnett is likely to be replaced? I mean, given, I think, the Prime Minister talked immediately after a Scottish referendum that he was going to stick with it. Well, outcome of the election. I mean, do you see it just pressure from whether other devolved nations and regions wanting tax-varying powers, or do you think the pressure will become so inevitable that Barnett will be replaced, or even part of it?
Yeah, I think the English issue is I don't see a lot of pressure in England for devolved powers. I see a lot of pressure from larger sort of city local government bodies for greater kind of fiscal powers themselves. And obviously, as you know, local authorities in England have far more powers anyway than local government bodies here. So they are quite large organisations delivering lots of services in their own right. So I can understand that. But I don't see your average English person wanting, you know, Manchester to have its own income tax rate and things like that. I just don't see that. I think the pressure all comes from the devolved regions, Scotland, Wales and yourselves. And I think I suppose if you were asking me personally, and it probably would be a personal opinion, not the Institute's view, because it probably wouldn't have a view on that, you know, that unless you got full fiscal autonomy, I think it would go down the direction of the Barnett formula being supplemented in some way to reflect need. And that would appease the kind of the English vote that perhaps you guys are getting more than your fair share of the cake because there's now a needs-based supplement in the measure. But I think if you did get to the point of near full fiscal autonomy where you were retaining tax and things like that, and I think there would be an absolute clear-cut case to change it completely to a needs-based system and ditch the Barnett formula altogether. You know, the Institute's view is it should be withdrawn, but that's because it doesn't deliver that accountability, or it doesn't deliver a needs-based approach, so it doesn't reflect that. And I think that's right and fair, you know, that's the position.
Well, over your approach, say, Chair, if we were to go down that need and equity principles, I mean, for example, would you be necessary, say, to provide additional funding for regions with greater need to eventually achieve that equalisation across the board? You know, if you're going to, is that what you're going to drive, and eventually over a long, quite a lengthy period of time, you will achieve equalisation?
Yeah. I think so, but I think it's something, you know, the Barnett has suffered from not being kind of regularly reviewed and updated. And as you know, it was a kind of temporary measure in the first place. When I suppose we talk about equalisation, you know, I'm taking it you mean that on a per capita basis you get to a point where the public spending per head in Scotland is very similar to England or very similar to Northern Ireland or whatever. I suppose I would take equalisation to mean that the central pot of tax revenue is redistributed in a way that reflects need. So I don't necessarily see equalisation as meaning that somebody in Scotland gets the same spending per head on their services as somebody in England, because again, to me, that doesn't reflect need and perhaps how the devolved assembly want to cut up their bit of the cake as well, and what their priorities are. What I'm talking about is a fair mechanism that distributes the central pot and gives you a subvention to reflect that need. That to me is kind of equalisation.
Yeah, and I suppose, Chair, and yes, no, well, even for us now, say whoever's elected next week, whatever government's formed, we will, under the current system, we would benefit if health spending rises reasonably steady. We will benefit. Take the point on social services are slightly different, so we have an integrated model of social services here that tends to be done by local government. So it's a very different model. But if health and education were to rise, and it probably has, even in the last Parliament, shielded us slightly from the worst effects of cuts in public spending. But of course we can divert that to whatever area of spend that the Northern Ireland Executive wants to put it into and address it. But that's going to be, over that time, there probably is this longing here that, if this is working well, and you mentioned earlier, keep your head down and just take the money effectively. But it's interesting, that entire debate around, I suppose, the structure of the UK, the fact that we're working with a system really devised in the mid to late 70s. 20 years after that, you had devolution to the various Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, and we still, 14, 15 years on, or 16, 17 years on, we still have that system and haven't really reviewed it. But pressure coming to devolve tax and the debate around, and I certainly feel in Northern Ireland we're probably not quite at the races on that debate, and as to how we would manage that, what taxes we might like to devolve. We had a presentation last week around our passenger duty, and I suspect that might be a tax that larger cities like Manchester or Liverpool might want to look at, maybe more so than, say, income tax, because it's disadvantaging, say, regions. And you're talking about rebalancing the economy. The entire UK economy is very, very heavily dependent on London and the South East.
Oh, it is, yeah, absolutely.
And if you even look at northeast of England isn't desperately, or the Welsh aren't desperately far behind us on their dependence on public spending.
Yeah.
So it's how we use the powers we have here and the money we're generating to best effect.
Yeah, and I suppose that's why I'm saying if you are, it's a difficult situation, I think, for you in the sense that you have a block grant. Yes, you do have discretion over that, and it's quite a simple kind of methodology for allocating that, which is great. In summary, I don't think you're too far away from what a needs-based assessment would give you anyway. That's what the evidence would suggest to me. You're within a kind of statistical difference of minimal that would make. But if you're going to really kind of rebalance the economy and so on, I think that you yourselves would probably want more fiscal levers to do that. Yes, you've got corporation tax, which is, I suppose, somewhat surprising that Treasury gave you that, so that's kind of a win, and I think others are looking at that too, in that manner. But yeah, you're probably slightly behind the other devolved regions where they've done things on landfill, income tax, and so on and so forth. But again, we're still in this position where any kind of loss to Treasury that's derived from that, you're kind of suffering the consequence on the block grant. So it's kind of, you're not benefiting from that. When I'm saying fiscal levers, getting to the point of hanging on to these tax revenues and being able to therefore come up with economic and financial policies that support growth in certain areas or whatever, that's the position where you can start to make real differences, I think.
I Chair, agree with even one line that stuck with me is one minister in the Republic of Ireland once said, small things around the margins can make a big difference too, and it's having the power to be able to change that. Your patient corporation tax, yes, you take the hit and block grant, and any increases in jobs, in income tax and national insurance don't stay here. They go back to the centre. So it is good. I certainly agree that we haven't, as a region in the UK, we haven't looked, seriously enough, or set up a commission to look at what powers would be desirable to manage in Northern Ireland and to really be the game changer. We've put all at corporation tax, might be great to get, but we've sort of spent the last 5 or 6 years just pushing solely for that without taking the more holistic approach that our Scottish or Welsh colleagues have done, and I think. Yeah,
and I get some sense that certainly the recent, trying to kind of look at my notes and stuff, but I know one of the commissions, the Westminster one, not the Scottish Finance Committee inquiry, but the Westminster inquiry, some of their output was looking at a kind of commission that would look into funding, and I think it is a commitment that a couple of the main UK parties have made to actually follow through with that. So, I think as opposed to the past in the 70s, 80s, 90s, where people talked about the Barnett formula and kind of left it as is, there is a probably more than probable chance that something will happen to it within maybe the next Parliament or in that kind of time frame. That would be, a view, because I think it is coming under increasing pressure, and there's a lot of people looking at it. And as you know, it's quite a high-profile thing constitutionally in most parties' manifestos.
Well, I think as well, even that idea of Barnett, we're solely dependent on say, the block grant, so it's, go to Westminster for more money if we hit any problems with. In our local government, all right, they've more powers now, the new model of local government, but something like 70% of their spend, they raise themselves through the district rate. Yeah. Whereas there's no correlation in Stormont between what we spend and what we raise. Regional rate accounts for 5% or something of what we actually spend, so it's all coming from London. Certainly if you were both in changing Barnett and going to a needs-based assessment and having more tax-varying powers, it increases the responsibility on what we all have to do or sign up to or how we raise money.
Yeah, I mean, that's why I think local government in some respects is quite a nice analogy, you know, because as you say, they're raising and retaining most of their funding themselves. They're getting a reallocation based on need through the rate support grant and other mechanisms like that. And I suppose at the end of the day, the councillors are accountable to those taxpayers for the services they provide and what priorities they come up with. So that's quite a nice model, really, of how that works.
Thank you, Jeff. Thanks.
Leslie?
Thanks, Chair. Just going back, you've touched on corporation tax in your report, and that's fine. And indeed, in the wider UK debate on the devolution of fiscal powers, what implication do you see from if we have these further powers devolved? What implications are there for the Barnett formula?
Well, I suppose particularly if you're starting to retain tax, obviously at the moment the way the corporation tax legislation is that you've got, you know, there's going to be a corresponding impact to the block grant and the funding you receive by any kind of, if you lower it, Treasury get less, you'll get less back in by way of block grant. So there's kind of nothing in that for you besides the fact that you're, you know, hopefully going to generate jobs and the right kind of jobs and attract foreign direct investment, whatever it happens to be. I suppose, yeah, if you're starting to retain taxes and things like that, like Scotland is with the 10p income tax rate and things like that, the idea that you can still be funded on a per capita basis in the same, you know, through consequential adjustments to English departments doesn't make a lot of sense, really. So I think in that situation, you know, it's completely at odds with that model. So it would come under severe pressure, in my view, to change. And I think
some of our expert witnesses, for example, pointed out that changes to the Barnett formula would become purely notional after a very short time.
yeah.
Do you agree with that?
Well, I just can't see why Westminster would continue with that type of model. You know, it's certainly not in anybody's interests, and clearly it wouldn't be fair and equitable. You know, if taxpayers in London, in effect, are saying, well, you know, you're retaining some tax of your own, and we're giving you a disproportionate amount of ours on top of that, you know, that just doesn't seem workable. And I think Westminster would rightly say we need to review that and change it. Now, whether they tinker around the margins and just include some other kind of measure which takes account of that, or whether they scrap it completely and go to a needs-based system, as I say, I think the more you move towards fiscal autonomy like that, the more you need a needs-based approach. And there's plenty of examples of how that works, you know, in local government, in police and fire services in England, elsewhere, and so on. So I accept what people say that, you know, a needs-based approach is going to be so difficult to get to. My view would be, well, there's lots of evidence of it working already in lots of areas in public services. You know, the problem will be negotiating what those needs are that reflect what you want. And that's why I'm saying that's the opportunity to get into the debate and say, well, look, you know, these are what our needs are. And clearly, you know, if you look at any evidence, there's a correlation that Northern Ireland has always historically had a bit more need than the rest of the devolved assemblies.
Does that really, in a way, hasten the demise of the Barnett formula?
Oh, I think it will, yeah.
It's just arising, you mentioned the corporation tax, well, one of the difficulties we see with it is that if in fact this is to pull very soon and we have the benefits that come from it and being able to phase those benefits, which are important, the difficulty is that with increased economic activity, you know, we generate more income tax, you know, we have more VAT, we have more national insurance contributions, they're all going back to the Treasury.
Yeah.
So really that's a disincentive in a sense. What are your views on that, Alan?
Well, yeah, as I say, I think in some respects the devolved assemblies are moving, in my mind, to a point where they are talking about, you know, what are the, as we talked about earlier, what are the fiscal levers and how would we manage that? You know, what are the fiscal levers we need to do this and how will we manage that? And I think there is a kind of developing consensus that the model of where, you, as you say, you do something on corporation tax rates, you generate more income tax through employment, more VAT through spending in the economy, and all that goes back to Treasury, and you don't benefit in the Barnett formula because that's cut down by... kind of doesn't really, yes, it's doing what it's supposed to do in terms of generating employment, but it's not allowing you to reinvest the benefits of that back into services or generating more employment or doing whatever. So I think there is a consensus that fiscal powers that the devolved assemblies have need to be increased to kind of make that work. And that fits quite well with the idea that you will then be accountable for your spending and also the taxes that you raise locally. So it gives you more accountability, I think, and kind of redefines that relationship a little bit with people, the citizens of Northern Ireland in that respect. So.
Thank you.
Keelan?
Sorry, Chair. Thinking about something else there. You're very welcome, Alan. And I know the Chair touched on it earlier on around the availability of data and that, and you did give raise some issues around that. But given the concerns which you and other commentators have raised in the past around the lack of transparency and independent public finance data, how can this be addressed in order to provide assurance around funding allocations and that any devolution of further fiscal powers is based on a fair and proportionate adjustment to the block grant here?
Yeah, I think a couple of things really is, I think historically that was the case that, public spending statistics and analysis were a little weak. I think it'd be fair to say that that's improved quite significantly. So I would have less concerns these days about the availability of information than maybe you would have had 10 or 15 years ago.
How has it been addressed? Can you expand maybe a wee bit more just on that?
Well, I think if you look at things like the public expenditure statistical analysis, the whole area of even the way the UK's moved on whole of government accounts and Treasury's ability to collect that sort of information has improved greatly. So I do see it as less of an issue. I think there'll always be issues at the margin where there'll need to be kind of fudged or consensus type decisions about certain things. If you took like the Olympics as an example, I know that obviously, we had swimming teams based here and various other things, but Treasury decided that was benefiting the whole of the UK, so there was no consequential benefit to you in terms of funding. So you kind of funded that out of your own pocket. So I think there will always be things around the margin that are not clear cut, and that's just the nature of it. And particularly now so because I think the three devolved areas have gone in slightly different directions. You're all at a slightly different point in time. Scotland are probably a bit further on from you, as you've said earlier. So I think that commission, if Westminster set it up, do need to look at what devolution will look like across those devolved assemblies, and there is maybe an argument if you want to get to this kind of position where you've got more powers and there's a subvention from central government based on need, what those powers should be, and all of the three devolved assemblies are at a similar point with those powers, not at different points, if you see what I mean, because that will make it difficult as well.
And obviously full economic decision making and financial accountability is required. How can we ensure that we secure this ability locally, and are there any lessons that we can learn from Scotland around this? I know you give some examples earlier on needs-based assessments. Are there any examples?
Well, there's plenty of those out there. As I say, I've got a document here which is the police grant, but local government do a lot of that. Police and fire services do a lot of that. There's international examples. So I think there's all sorts of examples. I'll go back to the issue that, agreeing what the needs-based measures are is going to be critical, obviously, and making sure that you can review those regularly enough, which is something that the Barnett formula suffered from. There's no reflection of population growth in Northern Ireland, for example, particularly in that, apart from more recent consequential type issues. But So, yeah, I think it's Scotland. I think one thing we're doing. Well, it's actually myself and a colleague are doing it next month. Is talking to the Scotland's Finance Committee about their fiscal framework. So, I think they've moved to a point where they're looking at the new powers they've got, but also how they're going to manage that, what kind of governance and control arrangements they're going to put in place, what's going to be their fiscal kind of mandate, things like that. And I think those are the issues that once you get to that point, they're the sort of things that you'll need to decide. If you get these powers, how are you going to manage them? How are you going to ensure that your borrowing levels are affordable and sustainable and you're not landing future generations with massive debt and things like that? So.
Thank you, Chair.
You said that how data is collected has improved greatly over recent years in terms of public expenditure statistics. But is that holistically? To come back to the issue of corporation tax, we got all kinds of figures thrown at us in terms of the cost of it. But obviously in terms of your Tesco's and your large stores here with the headquarters based in England, is it feasible to get those accurate figures? We've raised it with a number of witnesses, said that in a more federal system, that there are better systems in place to have that data available. But at the present moment in time, whereas, as you say, the data and how it's collected has improved greatly, has the breaking down of that data by different regions improved greatly? To be honest, I don't have evidence to really kind of tell you that. I would say, I'd be making a statement that I don't really, have a lot of evidence to suggest that regional data has improved. I know data has improved. And you're right, I suppose it is down to what they request. I know working in other sectors, I've had to fill in lots of forms as an accountant for the Office of National Statistics and other people like that monthly, and they're a bit of a pain, to be honest. But I now understand, working in the Institute, the purpose of some of that. So I think it is down to, if these measures are agreed, then I think the duty's on Treasury and others, or the, NISRA Statistics Office or whatever, to go and get that information and set up the systems that collect it. So I don't see that as a particular issue, because I've seen how it's worked from the point of view of somebody filling in the forms and sending the data back. So it's more of a system-driven thing, really. So I don't see that as a problem, because it's a process. You can set that up and deal with that. Okay, Peter?
Yeah, thank you for your helping so far. You mentioned, obviously, there's been a lot of particular different levels of political controversy, particularly across the world, across the water, in terms of Barnett, and I suppose particularly in terms of the desire for either replacement or reform. You're maybe getting, depending upon what the political perspective is, in different directions in relation to that. Now, in your statement of your submission, you talk about, which I think is obviously something that all of us would agree, by way of an objective about the resource allocation side of it being depoliticised, and it being some sort of commission which is independent of government.
Yeah.
I wonder, do you have any particular thoughts, or expand that, how you would see that happening, and how, I suppose, the concern over establishment of any commission, however supposedly independent, that it doesn't become simply a cipher for government or a cipher for the Treasury to do that, because I think we've all seen at times commissions, and mysteriously then they ultimately report what government would quite like them to report.
Yeah, I suppose obviously we would be of the view that such a body would have some sort of legislative basis. So, it'd be set up on a bit like the Office of Budget Responsibility, I suppose, or something like
That's
that.
a potential model type of, or at least
I'm not saying that's a potential model, but in terms of the relationship it has, in theory, it's legislatively an independent body which has a remit to advise government on its estimates and budgets and those kind of fiscal projections and things like that. So in the same way, the commission body would be, have a legislative basis like that, and its independence would be enshrined in that legislation. The appointments process, well, I suppose, obviously we'd want that to be independent too. And perhaps, on a fixed term basis or something like that, so you can get some kind of comfort that any risk of political bias or whatever is short-term at the very least. I think what you need to define is the relationship between that body and Treasury. At the moment, Treasury kind of make the rules and set that out in their statement of funding policy. What we'd be suggesting is that body actually kind of agrees the need process and tells Treasury. So Treasury are really just making the allocation and not making the decision about the basis of that allocation.
I appreciate from objectively from outside the attractiveness of an independent body.
Yeah.
I mean, to what extent do you think any government or indeed Treasury would potentially follow that on the grounds that if it is to be truly independent and very much set the parameters of policy indeed and funding in that regard on, in many ways it's taking a very huge political responsibility for quite a large amount of money in that regard. And I mean, to what extent do you see that being bought into therefore by Treasury or indeed?
Well, you said there about making policy. I suppose I would still see, you know, obviously the government for its manifestos and others makes policy.
Maybe that was a slightly wrong
Yeah.
phraseology in that regard on it, but you will have something that will have a very major financial impact on that side of things. And if you're effectively devolving to that body the power over that, you know, that will have a fairly significant impact on the broader sort of government position on that basis.
Yeah, well, in a sense, at the moment, you know, the Barnett formulas are mechanical calculations. So in some respects, there's no say over it at the moment, really. So I don't see as, you know, I see that as a fair and equitable position. I don't see it as, yes, I suppose politically some people might have a difficulty with that, but personally, I think, you know, that has to be the way to go. You know, that has to be the way to kind of get consensus over it. And do it independently. You know, policy may well be set by government and agreed with the devolved regions, but this body independently can get the allocation of that policy correct, and then Treasury just implement that.
Okay, thank you, Chair.
In terms of, I mean, you referred to earlier to the English votes for English laws debate that has gained some traction over the past year, certainly since the Scottish referendum. If that was to become a reality in terms of Westminster, how would that impact on Barnett?
Well, I suppose the idea of consequentials comes into play there. You know, if there's a vote in England which has a funding implication, you know, at the moment, you know, that vote in England, which may be for England only, could have a consequential funding requirement just because of the way the formula works. You know, because that is also a devolved function of the Assembly here. And if funding is increased or whatever, you'll get a consequential benefit for that. So again, in that circumstance...
Does that create another debate then? Because then...
It does a little bit, yeah.
Primarily, the English decision is made and then the other regions, so to speak, have to live with the consequences. So they're secondary to the English decision, so to speak.
So again, that funding formula doesn't quite work in those circumstances. So, you know, I think English devolution is, you know, kind of a lesser debate than what we have in the devolved regions, because, you know, we're kind of already on that road, and I'm not sure there's the same appetite there. There might be in that idea of dealing with the West Lothian question in terms of, you know, the Westminster actual vote situation and lawmaking, but the Barnett consequential issue is what impacts on that in my mind. You know, that they could, as a result of that legislation in England, have a funding consequential which you either get the benefit or not out of, and it may be something that you're, you know, either doesn't impact you, you're not interested in, or whatever, and lo and behold, you benefit from that. I suppose people in England would probably see that as fairly unequitable, and, you know, they might be right.
You think Barnett might struggle on for another 5 years?
I think it's a very difficult thing to change, yeah, I do, you know, but I suppose, you know, going back to what I said earlier, it's been that way for a long time, so you could take the view that it won't change. But what I'm suggesting to you is that it's under far more pressure than it has been in the past. So if it is likely to change, I think it's coming to that point relatively soon.
Okay. Any questions? No. Okay, Alan, thank you very much. That's a very useful contribution.
Thank you.
Report.
Thank you, Mr.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Hello. Okay, members, moving on to the next session on measuring well-being. I can refer members to the papers, pages 29 through to page 80. Okay. Okay, yes. I don't think we can. Morning.
Morning.
Okay, members, can I welcome to the committee Ms. Jennifer Wallace, Head of Policy at Carnegie Trust, Dr. Peter Doran, Member and Carnegie Associate of Queen's University School of Law, Ms. Michelle Murphy from NISRA, and Dr. Bernie Stewart from the Department of Finance and Personnel. You're all very welcome. Just before we go to questions, can I invite witnesses to make a brief opening statement? It may be helpful to first receive a brief recap of the Carnegie recommendations for the benefit of members.
Would you like to start with that, or start with the summary of the recommendations, or start with the summary from NISRA?
The recommendations perhaps would be best.
Maybe if I just
Okay.
tell you what we're planning to tell you about before the question. Somebody want to hear that? So we had obviously thought about telling you about the wellbeing work that ties in with how you would measure outcomes, which Michelle is going to give you a brief summary of. And then Jen was going to give you a summary of the recommendations. And then Peter planned to tell you just about how the report has been taken forward so far since it was completed.
Yeah, that's fine.
And maybe just to put that in context a little bit, it was completed, the report was completed, as you know, in March, and has been taken around a number of bodies, such as the Chief Executives Forum. And it's being considered by the Minister of Finance at the moment. But the plan will be that after he has considered that in a bit more depth, he would bring that then to the Executive for further consideration. And the thinking is that it could tie in quite well with the outcomes-based approach for the next programme for government. And as you know, there's quite a lot of other work underway in terms of outcomes-based approach, whole-of-government approach. So this whole report, it's an independent report, as you know, ties in very well with current thinking, and the timing is quite good in terms of moving into the programme for government. It also ties in well with the community planning function of the new councils, because they now have to come up with plans for their way forward, and their thinking in terms of an outcomes-based approach as well. So the idea would be that an outcomes-based whole-of-government approach would be the way forward, taken forward to the programme for government. So that's kind of the context. So if you're happy with that, then Jen can start with maybe the summary of the recommendation.
Okay, thank you. Good morning. I would just say on behalf of the Carnegie UK Trust that I'm delighted to be here with you this morning, and delighted at your interest in our work on this. As some of you might know, we started off as a roundtable in Scotland on wellbeing in 2010, and had some recommendations for that have been taken forward by the Scottish Government. We're very keen on sharing between the jurisdictions of the UK, so when there was interest in Northern Ireland, we were happy to help with that. I would also just like to stress that as an organisation, we're not a sort of shoot and run policy think tank organisation. We're in for the long haul. So if there are things that we can do as an organisation or with our associates, we'd be very pleased to help you in terms of the work that you might be interested in on wellbeing. I won't rehearse the process of the roundtable because I think you're probably aware of the journey that we went on. But in the end, there were 10 recommendations that were made. They are a package of recommendations, if you like, rather than a pick and mix, select one, select another. And they're about trying to move forward, as Bernie said, about a whole of government approach to improving outcomes for communities. So we started off with the idea of integrating wellbeing as a collective purpose through the programme for government, and that's the first recommendation. Because the international research and our background work shows quite clearly that having a sense of purpose, having a vision for government and having a shared narrative is helpful in a very complex policy environment that we all work in, where there are so many things that are interrelated. The second one is about a society-wide conversation on wellbeing. Again, from the international evidence, the importance of discussing with the community on what they feel wellbeing is comes out time and time again. And we put that one up as number 2 because we think that's quite critical to have that towards the front of a framework. Number 3 is about agreeing a set of strategic commitments and outcomes, which we've then referred to throughout as the wellbeing framework. So in our minds, there is an overarching purpose of government and then a series of agreed outcomes that themselves form a framework. And we would hope that that would be something that the government would be interested in terms of the programme for government going forward. We would then hope in recommendation 4 that future programmes for government look at the changes that would need to happen in public services and in other areas of government activity to create greater wellbeing. So you're then moving into activities of government and policy changes that you might want to implement as a direct result of a wellbeing approach. Number 5 is about training and capacity building. We found throughout our work and throughout the international work the difficulty really that some people have in understanding what wellbeing is, understanding what outcomes are, and therefore there's a process of change management, if you like, that has to be gone through and invested in. There's a recommendation on an annual report before the Northern Ireland Assembly, one that you might be particularly interested in because, of course, there are roles here for Assembly scrutiny, for scrutiny of government progress and social progress, and that's something that we would see very much at the heart of it. And then an additional recommendation on a standing advisory group because there is areas of significant expertise around perhaps some of them technocratic issues about indicators, some of them about community issues that we would hope would be able to help develop this, but also to keep that eye outside and a little bit of external scrutiny in terms of keeping things on track. So those are the recommendations as they were set out. Have I missed any? I think, okay. If you're comfortable with that, will we move on to Peter and tell you what's happened since the launch? Thank you.
Yeah, just very briefly, we had a launch on the 12th of March, and we handed over our recommendations to Minister Hamilton, who was very supportive and, as you heard, undertook to take the recommendations forward to the executive. Our chairs of the round table, Martin Evans and Ian McGinley, both chaired the launch and had an opportunity to present our findings to your chair on another occasion as well. We were delighted to be able to do that. We've been very, I suppose, very taken by the response to the report. The Minister has been very supportive. Just yesterday we met with the partnership panel, and as you know, part of the ambition here is to align the work of local government and community planning with some of the outcomes in the future PFGs. So yesterday's event with the partnership panel was excellent. We had a unanimous support for considering the content of the Carnegie recommendations. Both Minister Durkin and Minister Hamilton spoke very supportively, and indeed a number of the representatives of local government indicated they would like to take the recommendations forward for further consideration, and may well undertake a visit to Scotland to meet some of their counterparts. And your chair will remember at our first conference in 2013, he was really among the first to recognise the importance of this agenda for the integration and I suppose the new dispensation for local government to have them fully reflected in future PFGs. So thank you for that. There's been excellent support from the Chief Executives Forum, from parts of civil society, and you'll know that the recommendations talk about a new compelling narrative. In many ways, this is not a new narrative. What we're doing and what we're finding increasingly is picking up on conversations that are happening both within the public sector at the highest levels, within the civil service, but within civil society organisations as well, especially around outcomes, around the possibilities of building a new common language for governance around well-being. So that's some of the response that we've had. We're having a conference on the 10th of June when we will provide an opportunity for further responses to the recommendations. And I know that your chair has agreed to address the conference, and you're all very welcome to that as well. That's my contribution for that.
If you're happy now, Michelle will maybe just talk a little bit about how well-being is measured. Now, I would emphasise that this is not specifically about measuring the particular outcomes that will be in the wellbeing framework that Peter referred to, because it's a new way of measuring things, and I suppose a longer term measure rather than measuring outputs. It's about measuring outcomes, and Michelle can give an update on just what's available in Northern Ireland, what type of approach might be used, and if Michelle gives you a brief summary of that, we can move from there.
Okay, thank you, Bernie, and thank you to the committee for the opportunity to come back to you again. Myself and my colleague Kevin Sweeney were here last year to speak to you about this topic. You will have a slideshow presentation in your pack, but I'd been asked to just run through it in summary, so I'll not go through on an individual slide-by-slide basis, but if there's anything, I'll refer to a specific slide. If you want to look at it, then you can keep track with me. I have some background information in there about why measuring wellbeing. That was really just to give us a bit of a recap as to where this has all come from, and it's really that broader context, the international call for governments to measure all of what matters, and sort of getting away from this focus solely on the likes of GDP. It's really important to note that I'm not saying you don't use GDP, you still do. GDP is still very important. It's trying to get that wider dimension, and that's really what we mean by well-being. It's encompassing all of the economic, social and environmental sort of dimensions that influence our lives, our economic lives, our social lives and so on. Okay, so looking at what has happened recently in our near neighbours, if you like, in the UK, in November 2010, David Cameron launched a debate on measuring national wellbeing. Again, I'd like to note that that wasn't a particularly political step, because the previous Labour government had already taken steps to have these sort of developments in place for measuring wellbeing. And reflecting that non-political nature of it, David Cameron asked the Office for National Statistics to take the work forward. So the people there, obviously, David Cameron in the slide on number 4. The other individual there is Jill Matheson, who was the National Statistician at the time. ONS then undertook a programme of trying to identify what is wellbeing all about to the UK, and they had a very widespread consultation asking the sort of things that Diane and Peter were talking about, involving the citizen, asking people what does it mean to try to get those measures identified that way. There were a couple of events here in Northern Ireland as well, feeding into that. And the outcome then is the wheel that you see on slide 6, which hopefully you're familiar with. You've seen that from us in the past. And that wheel includes 10 domains, is the terminology used by ONS. It's 10 collective areas that the consultation showed were important to UK wellbeing. personal well-being, our relationships, health, what we do, those sort of things. And within those 10 domains, there are 41 individual indicators that are used to measure UK national well-being. Looking then at Scotland, and we've heard from Jen and Carnegie, and their involvement with Scotland obviously was pivotal in all of this. Scotland were actually probably a step ahead in that they had undertaken their developments in Scotland Performs even before the UK national debate was launched. And I know the committee has received information in the past on Scotland. You're familiar with the National Performance Framework. Slides 8 and 9 really just show you the snapshot of that, how it works at that high level, that there are a set of strategic objectives and a series of national outcomes. And then in slide 9, you have the measurement set, which I suppose is really where NISRA has come in. That's what we have focused on, is the measurements that have been used both in Scotland and in ONS. Slides 10 and 11 then are just a snapshot of something called a committee scorecard. And that's again what the statisticians in Scotland do for, as part of the budgetary review process. Each of the Scottish committees receive one of these scorecards, and in the scorecard it will have all of the indicators that are relevant to their remit. And you can see it's very pictorial, just a case of performance improving, performance maintaining, performance worsening, so the committees can see at a glance how the indicators that they have interest in have been performing over recent times. We're aware that the committees have found that to be very useful in terms of planning and developing their own work programmes going forward, because they can see the areas that they maybe need to look at in more detail then, given the performance over the previous year. So what have we done in Northern Ireland then about all of that? Well, you know that we've been involved with the Carnegie Roundtable as well, both NISRA and Public Sector Reform Division colleagues involved in that. But alongside that, we've also been looking in NISRA at trying to replicate, if you like, the UK, the Office for National Statistics, wheel of the 41 indicators, because the focus of the ONS work is very much on UK measures and UK indicators. So in March 2014, we produced the first release of the Northern Ireland data for those same measures. We've updated that since then in January last year, and most recently March of this year. And slides 13 through to 16 really just give a couple of snapshots, excerpts from that report that we published just recently. We developed a most recent report to try and incorporate more infographics to make it more user-friendly, and also to include some international comparisons. That was at the request of the Minister, where he wanted to see, well, okay, on these particular 41 indicators, this is where Northern Ireland is compared with the UK, but can we say where we are compared with other countries internationally? There's limitations, obviously. The report documents sort of limitations, but we did as much as we could to see, just at least it provides some context for the Northern Ireland data. So looking at those, the 10 domains and the 41 indicators, slides 17 and 18 just show you the extent of coverage of Northern Ireland data for those particular indicators. So you can see that in the personal wellbeing domain, all 5 of those UK indicators would be available for Northern Ireland. In the Our Relationships one, there's currently 1. The additional 2 will be available. We have added relevant questions to household surveys here in Northern Ireland that would make that information available. That's regarding satisfaction with social life and satisfaction with family life. The health indicators, we have all of the same information available. What we do, all of the same or very similar information available. Where we live, 4 out of the 6 are the same or similar. 2 that aren't currently available would be in relation to accessing the natural environment and households with good transport access. Then in the personal finance domain, 4 out of 5 would be the same or similar, and 1 is not available. That would be the indicator on wealth. We don't have the same survey here in Northern Ireland that gives information on household wealth. The economy, obviously, you look at the wheel and you look at the report, that is not available. That's because it's a national set of indicators in the UK economy domain. It's focusing on things like net public sector debt, it's focusing on net national income, inflation and so on. All of those things are collected for the UK but not for the regions. However, there would be alternative measures available for Northern Ireland, things that are specific to our own economy. The Northern Ireland Composite Economic Index, the number of businesses we have, the business survival rates. There's a whole raft of potential economic measures that we could use for Northern Ireland. Education and skills then, 2 out of the 3 UK ones, the same or similar Northern Ireland information is available. Governance, 1 is currently available and the other is forthcoming. One that's available is in relation to voter turnout, and the one that's forthcoming is about trust in national government. We have added a question on trust in the Northern Ireland Assembly to one of our household surveys. And in the natural environment, our final domain, 3 out of the 4 indicators we have the same or similar Northern Ireland data. The final one is, it's really just at the UK level, it focuses on energy consumed from renewables, which we don't have here in Northern Ireland, but we do have electricity consumed from renewables. So there is something, even though it's not the same as that particular one. Looking at the Scottish measures then, we've done a bit of analysis as to if we were to apply those same set of 50 national indicators here in Northern Ireland, what would we have? In terms of the 50 national indicators, we have the same or similar Northern Ireland data for over 2/3 of those 50. A lot of the ones that we don't have are things that are very specific to Scotland. For example, the Scottish Funding Council's knowledge transfer grant metrics, but obviously we would be producing something akin to that ourselves. And then for the 11 purpose targets that are in Scotland, we have the same or similar Northern Ireland data for all of those. The final sort of thing that I wanted to say was just about international developments in general. So we're going back to the start, if you like. The Scotland Performs and the ONS national wellbeing measures, there are similar measurement frameworks in place in a lot of other countries internationally. And Carnegie UK actually have looked at this in the past, and they've done an analysis really of similarities and differences across the areas that have wellbeing measurements in place. And you can see that there's an awful lot of commonality. The things that come out as being important to wellbeing are income, employment, housing, health, work-life balance, education, social connections, environment, personal security, civic engagement and subjective well-being. So that's not to preempt any sort of engagement with the public or the wider sectors, but that's likely to be the sort of things that will come out of that. So just in conclusions, hopefully I have given you an indication of the range of data that are already available that could be used to measure Northern Ireland specific outcomes of the things that matter to Northern Ireland, but in line with the findings from the Carnegie report, it's the outcomes that should drive the measurements, not the availability of the data. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you all for the work you have done. This is some excellent work from both the department and the Carnegie Trust in regard to well-being. Can I ask, how important is scrutiny in this here? I mean, it is very interesting the setup they have in Scotland in terms of the committees taking a hands-on role in regard to well-being. So how important is scrutiny? And also, are you all singing off the same hymn sheet? I mean, what is the department's view on what Carnegie has brought forward in terms of its report and in terms of Carnegie? Do you feel the department is going at an adequate enough pace in terms of moving well-being forward on the department's agenda?
Maybe if I answer the second bit of the question first, and then maybe Peter might like to comment on the scrutiny bit. In terms of the outcomes-based approach, I think it's fair to say that there's it's the widespread government approach now to measuring things. So the general acceptance of the direction of travel. In terms of the detail, it's not really just for the Minister of Finance to take that forward. It's a whole-of-government approach. So the Minister's considering the recommendations in detail and will be bringing his thinking to the Executive, but really it's an executive approach for the whole of the programme for government that is being recommended, not an individual department approach. So I think, yes, in the direction of travel, the detail has yet to be spelt out by the Executive. And Peter, maybe do you want to say how Carnegie feels about the scrutiny rule?
Yes, I know that Jen has a few things to say, but it is core to the, I suppose, the shift that we are anticipating. That if we are to shift towards a learning policy environment, a more supportive scrutiny function both across the Assembly committees, but also on the part of the Audit Office and thinking about the role of the PAC. The scrutiny culture is one that we have reflected on at the round table. So we would like to suggest that it's an area that we give consideration to. There's a high-level piece in terms of how we maybe bring the programme for government to life. You know, I think about it now as creating a 3D production rather than the 2D production. You know, so it's a participatory, ongoing conversation with opportunities throughout the mandate for the Assembly, but also wider society to engage in the conversation, a fully informed conversation if we have some new data linked to the outcomes and aspirations for government. But then at the more specific level, we have the recommendations for the report cards for the committees. And so the committees, for example, would be considering indicators and information about outcomes and aspects that wouldn't be reflected or be reflective simply of their departmental derived responsibility, what the outcome, what their contribution to the outcome would reflect. So there'd be a wider brief within the context of those reporting cards. That's part of the idea. But Jen has a few more comments about that.
The Carnegie UK Trust has been quite influenced by some of the international work. We came into this following the Stiglitz-Senfatoussi report, and we've been working reasonably closely with the OECD as well. The international community, the international trends come in part from an understanding of difficulty in trust in government, which is shared across advanced democracies and is not specific to us. And it's an issue that our public feel very strongly, and it's an issue that our parliamentarians feel strongly about as well. We have a large number of statistics that are available to us in the modern age, particularly I would say in the UK we're very well served by statistics, but we have to make sure that we're telling people consistent messages. So there is an issue about the extent to which we provide information to the public in a way that they can scrutinise the performance of governments, but then a separate issue about ensuring that parliamentarians can hold government to account on the basis of promises that they make to the electorate. So there are two slightly separate issues around scrutiny and around trust. We have said that, again, internationally, there is a split between the extent to which the type of wellbeing frameworks we're talking about exist as instruments of parliaments or assemblies or as instruments of government. And for us, it's critical that it's an instrument of government because we would like to see it influencing policy development. And if you remove it from direct policy development, then it becomes a useful scrutiny tool, but it becomes disconnected from the direct delivery of policy. Having said that, it's important that in a shared narrative, it is a shared narrative. So we would expect parliamentarians to be involved in the setting of the outcomes framework, the wellbeing framework, to be consulted on it, to be involved in it, to be informed about it, and then hopefully, in the way that is beginning to develop in Scotland, to be able to use that information to hold the government of the day to account more effectively for what they're delivering.
How do you ensure, I mean, obviously there's going to be engagement with all the respective departments in regard to wellbeing, but how do you ensure that the targets are not skewed? I mean, I would say there's a number of targets for departments anyway, and some departments arguably would set targets that they're going to reach, as opposed to making themselves go that extra mile. So how do you guard against the process being skewed by politicians?
I think there's an interesting debate about what we mean by outcomes. And there are different ways of interpreting outcomes. And again, if you look at the international work and some of the work in Scotland and in Wales, there are differences in what we think about it. So you have on one level some very high level outcomes. We want to be safer, stronger, healthier, happier, you know, and those levels are, you know, at one level macro issues. There are then, and I think what we're proposing is a more detailed set of outcomes, but still focused on outcomes. And when you're talking about inputs are very open to gaming, and activities and outputs are open to gaming. The closer you get to the high level outcome, the harder it is to game on them. So if I give you a concrete example, if you're talking about crime rates, it's relatively easy to game on crime rates because you can control what goes into the data. But if you're talking about an outcome that is related to people's fear of walking alone in their neighbourhood, which is one of the statistics collected, it's very difficult to game on that because that's how I feel or you feel. So it's harder for them to influence that directly without actually making some of the positive changes that we would hope government and other agencies would be making in that direction.
Okay. Adrian?
Thanks, Chair. Peter, in your opening remarks, you said you engaged and listened to conversations from communities and but whenever I look at who's been involved in this whole thing, I don't see many voices from the community or voluntary sector there at all. And how can you convince me that those voices are being heard? And also your outcomes, you know, just reading through, there's nothing that I wouldn't agree with there on your outcomes, but you know, people who I deal with day and daily are not really worried about increasing the energy from renewable sources. They're worried about the cost of it and how they're going to pay for it. And things like that are important to people and communities. But I don't hear those voices, or I can't see anywhere in this report that those voices are being heard. So it looks to me like a more academic study rather than actual people's voices feeding into it.
Yes. I think you're looking at the membership of the round table.
I looked at that, yeah.
And there were a couple of NGOs represented. But more to the point, we commissioned a number of focus groups. So we went into the community, the rural sector, youth, and we're very careful to pick up on views and reflect them in the report. We also did a series of stakeholder interviews conducted by John Woods. So while the members of the roundtable were processing the information wasn't simply coming from within the roundtable. It had a richer set of inputs, and there was also a consultation period when we received contributions from community-based organisations, voluntary arts, the rural communities, but also high-level inputs from OECD, for example. On the tension between the renewables and the cost consideration, I suppose what we're talking about is presenting that very tension, that trade-off, and actually allowing people to be involved in helping to appreciate that there's always trade-offs between costs and policy preferences, but also appreciating the context and maybe, you know, alongside the political decision makers a bit more in making those judgments and why those judgments have to be made at times. We're not saying whether we're not advocating particular policy points in our document. We're trying to suggest that it's more effective in the long term and good for society in the long term if everybody is in on the conversation and not just the end points, the policy.
I agree that that's more beneficial if everybody's in the conversation. I haven't seen that in this report, but I take what you're saying, and I wouldn't mind if I could see the report from the rural community, because that's somewhere I'd represent and I'd be very interested in.
Absolutely, we're delighted to pass on the the results of the focus groups to you?
I won't mind that. I've been really enjoying it. Thanks.
May I make an additional comment on that, please, Chairperson? I think it's important to stress that we thought long and hard about whether we were going to print this and present it. And it's important to stress that this is a draft. We've talked about there are difficulties about the word outcomes and the word well-being. We wanted to show people what we meant by it, but the activities that we undertook were not meant to be a large-scale community consultation on this. What we were interested in was presenting an idea and a starter, and then what we would hope is that other partners would be able to engage more directly with community groups on taking that forward if they wish to as a finalised version. So this is in no way a final version, it's very much a draft, and it's very much about just trying to communicate some of our concepts in a visual way, because it is quite a tricky and complex area. Thank
I
you.
didn't realise it was just a draft error. Thanks, Jim.
Keela?
Yeah, thank you, Chair, and thank you for attending again. Very good report. Framework. I just want to kind of, you spoke about it, the scrutiny, Peter, just in terms of 8.2, where you see the Audit Office and the Public Accounts having a role to play here as well. And as Chair of the Public Accounts, I suppose in terms of the point that you have made, in terms of the approach to the process can work with the PAC at times can compound the very nature of the job that you are trying to set out to do. But obviously our work would always be value for money, and we do focus a lot on the outcomes as opposed to inputs like yourselves often. So just to, I take a slight exception maybe to it, but I understand where you are actually coming from. So just as chair of the PAC, and there's other members of PAC here too, and I'm sure I would be delighted to have you with us at any time to discuss the framework and how we can help alleviate any issues that may arise around the process of the work. It certainly wouldn't be our intention to compound any work of any framework, as I said, because we are always interested in the outputs. The outcomes. But just in terms, obviously the framework is about changing minds and lives, and my opinion on that changing lives obviously starts within the womb. So improving life chances for our children and addressing inequalities, obviously in wanting to improve the levels of educational attainment is set within the framework. Where does that sit within the recommendations? At what stage would you likely to see that work being done within the recommendations? Would it be under recommendation 1 or 2?
I think maybe the point that Jen made, that this chart is an illustrative chart, so it's not preempting what the executive would agree to be the outcomes. Right. So we've described a framework as to what the outcomes might be like, largely based on Scottish and other measures. And Michelle has explained how you would go about measuring them. But the executive could, for example, say, well, that particular wording isn't what we want to focus on. We want to focus on a different outcome.
So I'm thinking on early intervention.
Yes,
basically.
so the early intervention is something that this committee has talked about many times. So some outcome might be based on that particular focus. So those are just illustrative, and a process would have to happen to say for the executive to agree what the Northern Ireland wellbeing framework would look like.
And obviously with the convergence of councils and the convergence of different departments, and the same that will apply here going into the future, that will help this framework.
Yes, and I think the point that was made in one of the recommendations is that it is a whole of government approach. So the outcome is focused on what it looks like from the citizens' perspective. So the different committees might be seeing the same dashboard indicators.
Yeah.
Because they have a contribution to make. So as you'd said, early intervention on children can affect, for example, justice outcomes many years later. So you might be investing in that. So the budgets then have to follow the outcome as opposed to departmental lines. So it's a new way of thinking, really.
I mean, obviously a new way of thinking, but we would be saying this is the way it should have been in the first instance, joined up this across departmental. But again, I'll just go back. I'm delighted to have you with PAC at any time at all to see how we can assist in the process.
Right, thank you very much.
Okay, John?
Thanks, Chair. I thought actually, Jennifer, when you talked in the opening remarks about the vision and shared narrative for government, I was wondering had you actually met the Northern Ireland Executive. The vision and the shared narrative wouldn't sum up what my thoughts on it. But I suppose I'm allowed to say that. Maybe you're not allowed to comment on it. I suppose basically, this most basic level is how do you make government relevant to people's lives, the individual citizen. That probably as politicians, that's good for us in that it engages the public. We could well be looking at an election Thursday week by 50% turnouts in many constituencies. So how do you make it relevant? How do you make it Bernie's point about budgets chasing outcomes or following outcomes, I think has to be at the key of where if you're changing government, because we have far too much of this, and I'm sure in your experience of civil service, being in different government departments, far too much of the silo mentality in government. It is about protecting budget lines rather than looking even where the outcomes are going. Your example of early intervention is well made. The benefits will come not only in education, it'll be in health, it'll be in justice, it'll be right across a number of government departments. But it'll be a huge shift in culture for a Northern Ireland Executive, Northern Ireland Assembly to start to move and to start to have the confidence to go down that road. I mean, how do you see it getting to where you think we should be, and the steps along? Because we're not going to just do it in one go, but almost the process of beginning that type of engagement and that change in culture.
I think you're right. Any of these changes that have taken place in any other countries have taken some years to come to full implementation. And I suppose when it goes to the executive, probably, as Michelle said, the general domains that are going to be common to most civilised cultures, but it's what you actually focus on, what changes you have to make, and I think it's going to be a gradual process. One of the interesting things that has come out of the work, as far as I've looked at it, is the focus on keeping the long-term outcome measure constant. Because in the past, and Dahi, you mentioned gaming in the past, sometimes if you measure an output and it isn't looking very good, you say, well, maybe that doesn't actually measure what we want to do, we'll measure something else instead, and it shows a better picture, and then it goes down and you change it to something else. But the kind of open framework that the wellbeing framework has is you have these measures set and people can see the direction of travel, and it might have a downward trend for a bit, it might go up, but you keep the focus on the long-term aim. And it is more difficult if you have proper measures in place then to sort of to change it. But it does mean that, and you mentioned the scrutiny has to take a different form then, because you're not saying, well, why did that go down last month and it's going up this month? It's more, are we still achieving the long-term objective? And are the interventions that we're doing putting us in the direction we want to go? So it's
more looking at the trend rather
than the actual individual numbers from month to month.
Yeah.
Because the other thing is then if you do a certain intervention over a period of 2 years and you're having absolutely no impact in the direction of travel, then you need to stop doing it and do something else. And I suppose that's
It probably just, Chair, brings me, I mean, one of the things I'd commented recently at an event was that we are not good, and this individual used the word about decommissioning, but we're meaning in the context of we're not always good at decommissioning services that don't are proving ineffective. So we stick with them, you know, and it ties in with that. How do we get better at actually almost fessing up and saying this isn't working? Let's stop that. Let's change that. And government, I think, as a whole, is not good at doing that.
If I may, on that point, there are a number of examples of appraisals for new policies using these frameworks. And one of our arguments for having a wellbeing framework at the heart of government is to tackle that point, because you can tackle, as new initiatives come forward and new pieces of legislation, to appraise them in terms of what impact they'd have on wellbeing. But the vast majority of our public services would deliver the same thing in the same way, continuing within that. So what we need to do is go back and have a look at what we're doing, how we're delivering it, and whether those things are meeting needs. And that will mean stopping some activities. But it also requires quite a strong evidence base, which is why some of this work is important, because we have to then have confidence, those of us engaged in this work, that those decisions are the correct decisions. So there are layers of evidence gathering and appraisal that would go on underneath this, rather than just, you know, a framework that has, say, 50 indicators in it.
If I could maybe... if I could add just a couple of examples of just exactly that sort of appraisal that Jen is speaking about how the UK measures have been used by some of the UK departments. The Department for Transport, for example, has used the domains and the wellbeing framework in a tool to help policymakers assess the social impacts of major transport investment decisions. And the UK Airports Commission have also used it to inform their quality of life assessment for a third London runway. So that's just some of the practical examples of how departments can and are using these frameworks in those sort of decision-making processes.
I thought the clue to the response to your question really lies in your own phrase, whole of government. Our co-chair, Aidan McGinley, is very fond of the phrase a systems approach. You know, there's two parts to that. If you're taking an incremental approach rather than a mid to long term direction of travel, you know, if you haven't set yourself mid to long term goals, then incrementalism can be quite dysfunctional. And also, if you're working within departments, the way in which you actually imagine the challenge can be quite limited as well. If you're not actually working alongside people from other disciplines, other departments, or even people outside of government. So part of the culture shift is to look at the way in which some of the what are regarded as entirely rational decisions at the microscopic level or at the micro level within the system can be dysfunctional when they're looked at from the system-wide perspective. And so this is a developmental conversation. It's not going to happen overnight, but it's about communication. It's about practices, embedded practices, and it's about the cues that the system gives to people within the system that might not serve the system well. And that's the point we're making about scrutiny. There was a sense that at certain points in the scrutiny process that the culture tends to reinforce risk aversion rather than innovation. And it's just an invitation to reflect on that and to begin to look from a system perspective rather than simply allowing what we have to continue without that deep reflection happening in the system. You know, so.
And if I may build on that, the experience I had, I did the international work for Carnegie a couple of years ago and travelled to Canada and the US, and in Virginia, where they have a system very like this and have had it for a long time, they talk about the pursuit of why. And this data in itself doesn't give them an answer. It's not a magic bullet, but what it does is help them answer the question, why is that happening? Why is that going up and that going down? Are these things related? Is there something else happening in society that we need to be concerned about? And it helps with that conversation and that pursuit of why in their experience, and also in the Scottish experience, I would say.
There's certainly, Chair, take Peter's point on the risk. I mean, like all things, you have to find the balance. I suppose where everyone's frightened of ending up in front of Michaela at the Other Towns Committee. You know, and that can lead to whether we've got the balance right in that, and maybe certainly keep asking why. Thanks, Chair.
Paul?
Thank you for the paper as presented here this morning. But I do take on board the comment made there that if we do something for 2 years and find it's not working, we need to revisit it. And I'm just wondering, that must be a novel idea, because we've fired millions into areas which are so-called deprived areas, and they still are deprived after millions have been put in, and there's no more money going into other areas. And I think certain communities, it wouldn't matter how much you threw in, you're not going to get the outcomes ever. And we continue to replicate that within our European funding priorities, and we fire money. And I mean, it's not just small money, we're talking about a large percentage of our European money has went into certain communities which have always been classed as deprived, and they're still deprived. And if you go into those people, the people say there's nothing being done for them, they get nothing. And I don't know whether it's either a culture or whatever. But just to go back to a point that was raised in relation to 8.2, and I just looked at some of the names that were on the roundtable panels, some of which have appeared in front of the PIC for very good reason. So I'm wondering if this has had some influence on the outcome of this for very good reason, not just for wrongful decisions, but the waste of millions of pounds of public money, not hundreds of thousands, but millions of pounds of public money, wrongful spend of public money. And I think, you know, it's sometimes be pertinent to actually maybe look at some of those reports and find out why they were put out in relation to some of those bodies, as opposed to maybe accepting it as a view that was put forward by certain individuals who have a personal axe or chip on their shoulder, maybe a chip on both shoulders, and because somebody challenges them, because we have a very much a process-driven system as opposed to outcome-driven system in this country. As long as you follow the process, you can do really whatever you want. Doesn't necessarily mean you have to have the outcomes, and that is where I have a big difficulty. I don't think we have an outcome-focused approach, and hopefully that going through this mechanism we will end up taking away some of the aspect of having just process with no outcome, and what we have created is an industry of people who actually spend their time analysing and coming up with where shortfalls are. Everyone knows where shortfalls are, and if you read this report, it actually identifies you could nearly lift from what has been done in other regions and say, well, health is a very big area that we've major shortfalls in. Doesn't mean we're not throwing enough money at it. It just means we're not using our money correctly, or we're going to have to redo certain things. So I do welcome part of it, but I would like some feedback in relation to some of the content of this. I believe has been based upon personal prejudice, and is there any way that could be screened out of a report?
Well, your conclusions are entirely in line with our own thinking, that we want to shift from a process fixated culture to one that is more respectful of the need to learn from experience and make the hard decisions if experience doesn't suggest that we're not doing the right thing. And your comments remind me of a conversation that we had with John Sweeney when he gave us the history of the Scottish framework, and also not just the framework, the Scotland Reforms framework, but the deep changes they made to their departmental structure. Actually deconstructed the departments, they installed one single budgeting officer, changed practices, got people to collaborate, think differently around policy design.
But that's not even easy to do within our culture, because once you start to introduce change, we have all sorts of problems. You will have, I'm not just talking about from a workforce point of view, you're going to have unions, you're going to have everything else. And as soon as you start to say we're going to deconstruct and what you see is not what you're going to end up with, we're going to have a complete change here. You're going to end up with you know, City Hall or around Belfast City Hall every Saturday morning. There'd be placards and protests every day because you want to change certain things. And, you know, that's a culture that has to be actually embraced and worked with to ensure that we all have the right reasons for going forward. We're not here as an employment agency. We're here to deliver service.
Yes.
We're here to ensure that that service is delivered effectively and efficiently, and we're also trying to use whatever public money we have to identify those social areas that need help and need assistance, and ensure that that outcome comes. I would like to do what you've just outlined. Unfortunately, I know that I've come up against extreme public opposition, not just it'd be primarily from within the industry itself.
Yes, I was going to say it wasn't so much what they did, but what triggered the process in Scotland was the very point that you were making. They arrived at a point where they realised that they were investing a lot of resources in policy aspirations that were simply not being realised, and they couldn't continue. And I think there's some public sympathy, at least, for the need to shift resources to where they're most effective and where there's visible outcomes. And if the public are more engaged in the processes of deliberation around those decisions, that is actually part of the well-being piece as we see it. When people have more control of their lives, more control of over the decision making, a greater sense of where the decisions are coming from, they will be much more tolerant of the decisions if they're participatory. So part of the piece here, as we see it, is that if the local government and community planning, if their aspirations are more fully reflected in this process and the PFG, then you develop a more sympathetic public, a more literate public, I guess a learning society around the learning organisation that we want government to become. So I think you're right. None of this is going to happen overnight, but it's about different expectations from ourselves as well as from the public, who you might imagine at this stage, if we were to declare some of these changes as a diktat, coming from on high, we're talking about a more collaborative, horizontal model of governance with greater levels of insight all the way, from the design to the delivery. You want to say something?
I'd say our Enabling State programme at Carnegie covers a lot of very similar ground to this, and in fact wellbeing is one of the key recommendations from that work as well as from this. And if you take a slightly longer term view of what we're delivering with public services, you can say in the post-war era we were able to improve people's well-being by giving them something. We gave them education, we gave them health services. It had a transformative effect in our societies. In the 21st century, we can't do the same thing. We have to work in partnership with people. Their well-being outcomes, as we've been talking about them, are interrelated. We can no longer deliver something to somebody and expect them to have a radical change in their well-being. So all we see are small incremental increases. So we increase the budgets all the time when we're able, but we don't see the same corresponding transformative effect on people's well-being.
But well-being can sometimes be a perception among individuals. Some people feel they're perfectly happy and they might have absolutely nothing, but as long as they're quite content, and what your interpretation of their well-being and their interpretation of their well-being is two totally different things. And I know some people who have absolutely nothing of this world, you going for them, yet they're quite happy and content, and you say, they don't want any change, they just want it that way.
But then that's one of the things that we need to be clear about in measuring the well-being, the wheel of well-being and so on, is a common definition agreed with everybody from the general public to the politicians to government as to what is important to people. So those measures are very important in making a decision on a future policy, because if you're contributing to the agreed definition of what well-being is, then it's more visible to everybody. And Jen had mentioned the visibility to people of the whole picture. So if you can see that although maybe your education provision in your local area is moving to somewhere else, but it'll be better overall for your children, you'll be happier with it. even though it might have a negative impact, say, on your daily journey to work. But if you're getting something that contributes positively to your life overall as measured, you'll be happier with it, as long as it's visible to you. And I think it's going to be very important that the community can see what this whole picture is like.
Can I ask, I'm always very, very conscious that there's a great and a majority of individuals out there who actually don't engage with anybody. Therefore, their voice is very rarely, if ever, heard. And that is by a large percentage, majority of people that don't engage in a lot of, they tend to live their own life. But if you have a very strong lobby who actively go out to engage, and therefore by their engagement they effectively try to change government policy, not only government policy, but they will effectively change, and put legislation in place to actually protect them because of their very strong and sometimes militant lobby. On that basis, how is there protection given to the weight? And it's something which I don't believe is maybe properly measured. You could have 1,000 people who wish to write in about one specific issue. You might only get 10 writing in about another, and yet the 1 to 10 is probably more important than the big lobby group for the 1,000. How is that measured, and how is that equated? Because you just cannot take a blanket, well, we received so much communication about this issue, we had to change policy to ensure that was done.
Can I maybe add that because of the ONS wellbeing framework, we have a series of those very questions that you were talking about, the individual's own perception of their wellbeing, their happiness or satisfaction with life, their anxiety states and so on. And they are added, we have them in our Northern Ireland surveys, and they're to the general population. So hopefully getting some of those people who you're saying don't engage with government per se, we pick them up in our household surveys. And when we get to the point where we have enough data, because obviously it's a household survey, but we're merging the years together, they're the sorts of
how are those households identified?
They're randomly selected by address. So when we get to the stage where we have enough data, we want to be able to look at those sort of things and what sort of things influence some individuals being happier than others. And you may find that very point that you're saying, that those individuals who, from an objective perspective, seem to have very little, can be higher up on that happiness sort of chain.
It's a state of mind.
And across the UK, those questions have been added to over 20 government surveys by policy areas looking at health and crime and housing and taking part in sports and culture. So all those different policy areas across the UK have added those questions so that they can look at that question as well. What is the impact of our sort of service on individuals and on
yes,
their...
many of the happy pills they've taken that day, whether you get a good... I honestly am a sceptic in some of these things, because I do appreciate that we have an area where, if you look at statistics as they're presented, you would believe that we are in an area which is deprived of all sorts of functions, everything else, and also health-wise we're probably on the back foot according to the rest of the United Kingdom. Yet whenever you look at the statistics which are used to measure and I'm trying to work out measure the calculation used by doctors and doctor surgeries for their drawdown for their certain area and the quota that is required for it, because it's something which we did actually study. You found that we actually, in many areas, we scored higher, much higher in relation to health than any other part of the United Kingdom. And he sat back and says, but that's not true. We've been told that we've been suffering from, because of the troubles with more on antidepressants, from more this, that. The statistics didn't bear it out. Yes, the prescription writing did, but the statistics didn't. That's the point. And I'm just saying it's something which I honestly believe that, I know we have to engage in this, we have to get it, but I still think we have to also be conscious of those who actually maybe try to skew the outcomes and the outputs by putting forward a lobby or a group to drive government policy down a route which we end up putting forward, prioritising things which maybe are not necessarily the most important things in the community. Sorry.
Where the community consultations that we're recommending have happened internationally, they've been done to engage the views of thousands of people. So it's quite a different model from a paper-based consultation exercise where you might get responses from umbrella bodies and so on, and special interest groups, to try and actually access what the views are of some of the people that you're talking about. The difficulty is that you then have to triangulate that with some of the expert view of statisticians on what is measurable. So there's a job of work to do to bring that together into a coherent framework.
I always have a fear of academics trying to tell us what is important, because sometimes their view of what is important is self-protectionism as well.
The only other additional point I would make on that is that most of the indicator sets where this is done around the world blend objective data like exam results with perception data, you know, how you feel, for example, about your own levels of literacy or education, and then with the subjective well-being data you're talking about happiness. So it's a whole, rather than just one. Thank you.
Can I ask in relation to those who actually had input in this, and I believe that the chips to bear or chip on both shoulders possibly in the outcome, and I just use it. This
I'm not going to name names.
I'm happy to. There's 3 of them on the front page. This approach compounds somewhat by some of the work of the PAC and associated media coverage that is often adversely in nature, adversarial, in nature, rather than focusing on the shared endeavour. It has a specific role and it has a job to do, and it must do it. And if some of those people felt that that was vitally important to include in this report, I think their priorities are far from right. And I'm putting that down because I don't think it should be.
Yes, go ahead.
I'll make two points. Firstly, the long document was the document by the Secretariat. So yes. John Peter and I wrote that. It's not necessarily a consensus document by the group. The short report with the recommendations in it is the consensus and agreed view of the group. We took evidence. I wouldn't know where that one came from, if it came in from evidence, so I couldn't tell you that. But my reading of it, and when we were writing it, is that that adversarial comment was more about the media coverage generated by it. So I would just temper it. I appreciate that perhaps we could have written it slightly more carefully if that was the case. Do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I think it is about the way in which the media amplify some of the findings of these bodies.
But the media by their nature don't like good news stories, so therefore they focus on everything which, and unfortunately if something which comes out, we don't necessarily want it to be made public. We want to ensure that there's lessons learned from it.
Yes.
That's one thing. But the fact that the media jump on it because they like to show that, you know, see those guys up on the hill there, they haven't a clue what they're doing, and this is what's actually happening, and they're allowing this to happen, and look at what happened under their watch. And it's not always good for us. Some of those reports, it actually shows flaws within governance issues associated with us. That's fine, but it's right to be highlighted. Yes. But the point is that we deal with a media which is very much not our friend. It is actually trying to put us down on every occasion. And in fact, if you really were wanting a profession or a calling, you wouldn't say, I want to be a politician. You leave yourself open for all sorts of abuse day and daily. So therefore, you know, it's not necessarily the sort of thing that the media want to portray as a positive. Yes. They want to put it across. Yes. So I think it should be more geared towards what the media's perception. They never sell very many good news stories about Northern Ireland. You have to actually go out and try and ensure that they cover it. And even then, you might just get a small mention to focus in on something which is irrelevant.
Yes, yes. So we were making a very modest point that. And we would never dream of questioning the need for rigorous scrutiny and for naming the issues when the issues are identified. But our point to the Audit Office was that it would be useful to find ways to balance that part of the role with institutionalising the learning that needs to be captured when you have these reports and process. How do you disseminate the learning and ensure that it's
Doesn't
not going to
replicate.
happen again.
Exactly.
You know, that's what we talk about, a learning organisation, but that you don't have cues that maybe are even unintentional, where the functions and the practices of the auditors are signalling that we only want to talk to you when things go wrong. Should it not be a continuous conversation, a capacity building, disseminating good practice, helping those who get it wrong to get it right next time and ensuring that they do? So more continuous engagement with the organisation as a whole. I think that it was a very modest point that we were making, and we certainly weren't questioning the need for rigorous scrutiny
Thank you.
and naming the issues when they have to be named, because this is about effectiveness as well as well-being.
Thank you.
Okay, Ciara?
Yeah, Chair, I just wanted on earlier, but just to follow on from that, it's about, I suppose it's about having the confidence of taking risks and how you manage those risks. That's what it's about. But just a point Paul was making earlier around policy change, and this is just a comment, and you don't have to respond to it. Just in terms of policy change, when we look at just an example of transforming your care, TYC, love it or loathe it, we have it, and my opinion is there are aspects and parts of it that are very good, but just in terms of the funding to follow TYC, which hasn't really happened in my opinion, and indeed, you know, communities are well tuned in on that subject matter, because that's what I've been canvassing on the doors the last few weeks, and I'm hearing that from the individuals concerned, and I suppose around the funding aspect of policy change, you know, that has to happen, and in my opinion it hasn't happened with TYC in terms of care in the community, so that's a big aspect as well as funding. It's just a comment I wanted to make, Chair.
Okay. Leslie, last word.
Yeah, it's, I wasn't going to speak at all, but I do appreciate the good work that's been done. But the big difficulty I have is identifying, what is process driven and what's outcomes. And we have a major problem. Process wins most occasions. So the thing that does concern me is how you apply objectivity to this whole exercise. Obviously, you've got to be objective. The trouble, in my opinion, is that the responses you get are, in fact, subjective. It's what people feel. You then have the dilemma, which Paul mentioned, and I identify with that as well, with loud voices, organised society, an insatiable demand. Jennifer mentioned, for example, they're rewarding people. That's okay, but if you live in a material society now with an insatiable demand, how can you reconcile all those things, deliver the greater good where it's needed, and not simply be part of a process that we'll be still doing in 25 years? I've travelled a fair bit in my time so far, but one of the most remarkable things I learned was in Malawi, and there are not too many people in Malawi. Never known a people to be as happy and content, and they have nothing. Absolutely nothing. So this material thing is something that concerns me, and I don't know how you can actually see the wood for the trees in this one. Are all the responses going to be, we want more of this, more of that, more of the other? How are you going to be objective, and how are you going to appreciate that these things coming to you really should be subjective?
I think if I could maybe just come in with the word well-being, I think maybe some people interpret it as being just the subjective measures. But what Michelle's presentation illustrates is that once the executive and local government and the citizens have agreed what are the outcomes they want, then there are measures pinned down, some of which are objective measured through surveys, but some are tangible measures. So we will never be doing away with the measure of GDP, which is factual. So there are factual measures as well which indicate, another one that Jen mentioned earlier, the number of qualifications.
Just on that one, if I may, Barry, interrupt you there. Why GDP and what GVA? Why not GVA?
Well, GVA, GDP, but it's a tangible measure, whichever.
Which one?
Well, it's actually GVA is what's used now, but I think people still refer to it as GDP. But but GVA is actually the more modern measure, but it's a tangible number that you can get to. But it still gives you, if you combine a number of subjective measures with objective measures, but you know up front what you're going to be measuring, then that you can get an indication of whether you're going in the direction of travel of the outcome you require. So it's not just how do people feel about this. It is going to be difficult to do, there's no doubt about it, because it is, as many of you have said, a big change, and it's a more holistic look at things. But if you move in that direction, then it's clear to people what they're trying to get, and it does allow you to stop things. And Michaela mentioned, for example, transforming your care. But the objective of that is to improve the health of people longer term. If some of the measures that are put in place there are not working, then this is all about having a measurement base to say, well, actually, we're not improving it by doing that, so we can change that. But it is all based on evidence, not subjective feeling. I think it will take a lot of time to bed in. It will take a cultural change. It's not going to be easily accepted by people. But if they're involved in the process from the beginning, I think it should end up as a better outcome. I don't know if you want to add anything.
I think we talked a bit about domains of well-being, education, housing and so on. It's, in my view, almost impossible to conceive of a well-being framework that does not have outcomes on each of those domains. And those are internationally recognised and well known. What the local level that comes in at is the level underneath that said, well, what is education in Northern Ireland? What is a good education in Northern Ireland? What is the level that people are comfortable with? Or what is safety? So safety, for example, in Scotland and feeling safe in Scotland is quite different from feeling safe in India. You might want to use different outcomes for that. You might want to use different measures. And that's where the community consultation comes in. What does the community understand those outcomes to be in their local area? But it's not about saying we only want education or we only want health. But saying, how do you understand this in your local context? So when we're talking in Scotland about doing one of those large-scale consultation exercises, we're talking about starting off from a base of where people are, because that's what they understand. So what do you need to live a good life? Moving up a rung to...
But you see, just on that one, when you say, what do you need to lead a good life, is that purely material again?
No. So people...
How do you measure the psychological?
There are well-known measures for it. So in Scotland they use the Warwick Edinburgh Mental Health and Wellbeing Survey, which is called WEMWEBS for short. The short survey is 10 questions that asks about your anxiety levels, your satisfaction, your social networks, and then gives one score. And then you aggregate that up to society level and say, for Scotland, we have a level of well-being of, I can't remember the figure, but it gives you a figure.
How do you weight that? It can't be the same in all parts.
You aggregate it up. You don't weight it. You just aggregate it. It's just a simple index. It's not a weighted index.
An index?
For WEMWEBS, but WEMWEBS is only one example. The ONS 4 questions are a different example of how to do it. There are different ways of getting at the subjective, but again, the subjective is only one element of all of the different indicators that you would want to put into a wellbeing framework.
That you said that you want to put into it. You have to watch you don't end up superimposing your own views. That would worry me as well.
Yeah. Well,
maybe this is a sort of discussion for another day, because we're getting into the more abstract here. But it's very important.
It is.
It's got to be got right, or it's meaningless.
I would say the other two questions that we're looking, so there's the individual one, and largely that is about understanding and helping people get into a conversation about well-being. The second level questions are about what does Scotland need to flourish or to thrive. Flourish is language that we've been using in Scotland for quite a while. So you're asking people then to move slightly further away from themselves and into a Scotland-wide setting. And we've been trialling that in Wester Hailes, which is an area of reasonable deprivation outside of Edinburgh. And we found actually people can make that jump pretty well. So they can move from what I need to what we need as a society in a managed and facilitated session. So that's what we're recommending and moving forward, and how you have some of these conversations so that we can avoid some of the pitfalls that I think that you're raising in terms of how we can move that forward in a meaningful way.
I'm coming at it from the perspective of the next stage. You know, once the outcomes are identified, then how do you identify how to measure those particular outcomes? And if you look at the how ONS approached that, they developed and published a set of criteria as to how they would select the measurement things. So that's the sort of model that could be interpreted where it is transparent what the criteria have been for inclusion or not.
You need to continuously validate that response.
The criteria
For a period of
themselves, well, that would have been one of the criteria, would have been whether the statistic is, you know, reliable and collected over a period of time, and where it was available. There were a whole range of different criteria, the geographical levels that it was available for, and so on.
And more recently, the OECD has published criteria as well, which are similar to the ONS ones, but slightly more up to date.
Okay, thanks, Chair.
Thank you. Just to conclude then, I mean, obviously the Minister is to bring this to the Executive for consideration. Do we have any indication of what the timetable is for that? Does it have to be done before the summer, or what is the timetable for the programme for government?
It's not set yet, but the programme for government timetable, as you know, is imminent. So as soon as possible, we haven't got a date yet. He would hope to bring it before the summer. Timetables being agreeable to that.
Mm-hmm. And what are the next steps for Carnegie on the months ahead in terms of this process?
Peter mentioned the conference, which will be, we're hoping, quite a large and quite a public event to try and gather some more views. We'll take stock after that. Peter Doran and John Woods, both Carnegie Associates, have agreed to stay with the programme until the end of this calendar year. So we will continue a range of meetings, stakeholder meetings, presentations, advocacy events, obviously engagement, and see where we are and take stock closer to the end of the year. But as I said in my introductory remarks, the Carnegie UK Trust is committed to this and committed to continuing its relationships and partnerships in Northern Ireland on wellbeing. So if there are things that you feel that we can do to assist, please do come and have a conversation with either Peter, John or myself.
Okay, excellent work. All right, thank you very much for that. Okay, members, we're slightly behind time, so we move on to subordinate legislation. The Statistics and Registration Service Act 2007, Disclosure of Patient Registration Information Regs NI 2015, pages 82 to 89 of your packs. This has been laid in the Business Office for formal consideration, subject to affirmative resolution procedure. On the 4th of March, the committee considered the initial proposal. Members were then content, and the Department confirms no changes to the policy since then. The Examiner's Statutory Rules report was published on the 28th of April, and it's confirmed there's no points to raise. If members are content, I put the question: the committee has considered SR 2015-208, the Statistics and Registration Service Act 2007, Disclosure of Patient Registration Information Regulations NI 2015, and recommends that it be affirmed by the Assembly. Agreed. The Whole of Government Accounts Designation of Bodies, Order 2015, pages 92 to 102, subject to negative resolution. At the meeting on the 11th of March, the committee was content with the proposal. Departments confirms no changes since, and examiners raising no points. So the members are content. Put the question: the committee has considered SR 2015-152, the Whole of Government Accounts Designation of Bodies, Order NI 2015, and has no objection to the rule. Agreed. Public Service, Civil Servants and Others Pensions Amendment Regs NI 2015, page 104 to 121, subject to negative resolution. At the meeting on the 25th of March, members were content. Department has made no changes, and the examiners raising no points. Members content. Put the question: the committee has considered SR 2015-181, Public Service, Civil Servants and Others Pensions Amendment Regulations NI 2015, and has no objection to the rule. Agreed. Correspondence.
Okay, Chair, there's various pieces of correspondence. Members, just bear with me for a moment or two. I'll just pick out the items that require decisions. The first item is on page 124 of the pack. It's DFP writing in relation to European legislation, and in particular around public procurement, alternative dispute resolution mechanisms, and the department's explaining that this is an area that's under review at the moment, particularly in terms of those mechanisms being in process prior to the award of contracts. So it's just something the committee may wish to maybe seek a briefing on, maybe as part of a wider public procurement briefing in the work, for the work programme, if members are agreed. And then there's correspondence at page 126, again from the department. It's the committee had asked for information on issues coming up from different business areas within the department, and the department has responded providing some information there, for most of which I think the committee was aware of. There's no mention of bills, Chair, and I know that there are two bills coming from the department. One is, or likely to come from the department, one is the Legal Complaints and Regulation Bill, and the other is the Rating Amendments Bill. And it's just in terms of working back from the end of mandate, it would be important that from a committee perspective that the committee's given enough time for scrutiny, so it might be useful if the committee just writes to the department to emphasise the importance of bringing those bills forward in time for adequate committee stage scrutiny, just at this stage, Chair.
Agreed.
And just skip on through to, there's correspondence at page 154. It arises from ministerial briefing last September, and just again it's about work programme, scheduling items in the work programme. The committee normally has a briefing from the Minister in September, the beginning of the session, each session just in terms of the Minister's strategic priorities for the department, and that then informs the committee having a workshop immediately afterwards in terms of its strategic priorities. So it's just to seek agreement, Chair, to notify the department of the committee's wish for that to continue in terms of this upcoming September, to schedule that into the programme if members are content.
Agreed.
Then, Chair, page 157, there's correspondence. DFP sends the committee regular or occasional reports on monitoring of savings delivery plans across all departments, and the committee then circulates that round to the other statutory committees for scrutiny. It's just there's various issues there. It's not particularly in relation to DFP, but in terms of other departments that other committees may wish to follow up, undertake follow-up scrutiny in particular in terms of the up-to-date position for 14-15, and also in terms of the identified risk to service delivery and the impact on frontline services. So seek agreement to copy it around the other statutory committees to pursue and maybe highlight those areas in particular.
Agreed.
So, Chair, just on that one, will there be a month 13, we call it that, where we actually get the final?
Yeah, Chair, the committee does receive a further report giving the final picture. And
that's only an estimate there for.
But in terms of individual committees, there's nothing to stop them.
No.
Scrutinising them. Yeah. Then there's correspondence at page 212. The department has provided a formal written response to the flexible working inquiry report, and it's just to seek agreement to publish that on the committee's web pages alongside the inquiry report.
Agreed.
There's correspondence at page 227 from DFP in relation to statutory bereavement damages, and this issue arose from correspondence received from the Association of Professional Injury Lawyers, and it's really cuts across both the Department of Justice and DFP, so it's to seek agreement to copy the DFP response to both the Association of Professional Injury Lawyers and the Committee for Justice for information. Sure. And then there's correspondence at page 231. The Strategic Investment Board is responding to two issues that the committee raised. One was in relation to the ongoing review of social clauses, and the other is in relation to the investment strategy delivery tracking system, which is an issue which this committee has been pursuing ever since it received a briefing from the Construction Employers Federation around raising concerns around the information that's contained on that portal. It's the aim of which is to keep the industry updated on procurement opportunities, but the Federation, I think, felt it wasn't meeting its aims and purpose. So there's some clarification from SIP around that, and also information in terms of steps that is taken to improve this, including procurement guidance, note to departments who have the responsibility and arm's length bodies for updating the information. So it's just really to seek committee agreement to copy the extract from that letter to Construction Employers Federation for an update, and when there's a procurement briefing down the line, then the committee can receive further information in terms of procurement guidance and how that's taking effect. Then finally, there's just an invite from Colleges NI to an event on the 27th of May, and also an invite from the Consumer Council for a briefing with yourself, Chair, so it's just for noting. I think that's all the correspondence.
Okay, forward work programme, page 244 of your packs. Can I seek agreement to also schedule a progress update briefing on implementation of the NICS People's Strategy, which is an issue requiring routine monitoring. Members content the work programme's update reflect any agreements made today. Any other business? Next meeting due to the election next week will be on Wednesday, the 13th of May at 10 a.m.